Yes, life can be wonderful if you're not afraid of it.
This is the movie Limelight, one of my absolute favorites.
All it needs is courage, imagination.
It was one of Charlie Chaplin's final movies. In it, my grandfather plays a washed-up clown who saves a suicidal dancer.
What is there to fight for?
Ah, you see. You admit it. What is there to fight for? Everything. Life itself, isn't that enough? To be lived, suffered, enjoyed. What is there to fight for? Life is a beautiful, magnificent thing.
Many critics saw something autobiographical in Chaplin's character Calvero, the fading star long past his peak. This movie was released in 1952, and Chaplin had been in the United States for 40 years.
You've given in, continually dwelling on sickness and death. But there's something just as inevitable as death, and that's life. Life, life, life!
His character convinces the dancer to fight, to go on. She regains her confidence and her audience. But Charlie Chaplin, in real life, never would. And in truth, his fight was coming to an end. From the BBC World Service and CBC podcasts, this is Hollywood Exiles. I'm Oona Chaplin. Episode 9, Naming Names. As the Hollywood 10 went to jail, the House Un-American Activities Committee regrouped.
The hearings began again in 1951.
This is Larry Sapler, author of The Inquisition in Hollywood.
And people started naming names.
Naming names. This was the practice of going to Congress and outing people as communists. By now, even sympathizers were compelled to name names. If they didn't, their own careers and their whole lives were on the line.
All you can buy up these stairs is a bullet in the head.
Starring Joan Crawford, the screen's most dynamic artist. Sterling Hayden as Johnny Guitar.
This is from the trailer for a movie called Johnny Guitar, a Western from 1954 directed by Nicholas Ray for Republic Pictures. Sterling Hayden was a leading man, but his career was on the line when it was revealed that he'd joined the Communist Party. He could have joined the roster of Hollywood artists who were out of work, people the big studios refused to hire on account of their politics. He was called before the newly convened HUAC hearings in Washington, at which point he had a choice. He, like many others, chose to save his own career. And on the 10th of April, 1951, Sterling Hayden named Robert Lees to the House Un-American Activities Committee. Lees was a writer in Hollywood in the 30s and 40s, and he wrote for star comedians Abbott and Costello. He was also a member of the Communist Party. I'm here in Topanga Canyon, north of LA, to learn more about him. Tanya Verrifield knew Bob for the last 20 years of his life. Robert Lees was Tanya Verrifield's grandpa, sort of.
And so he was my grandpa, Bob.
Tanya's grandmother was Bob Lee's partner in his later years.
And so for the 20 years, he was a part of our family. He was a bonus member of the family, as we said. And he and I came up with the nickname Grand Pal because he wasn't just my grandpa, he was my friend. He talked about the day that they came to his door and presented him with a pink slip, and that he went into the backyard and he looked around at this enormous home and beautiful property and his children playing and his wife. And he didn't say a word to her because he didn't want to. He was on his way out to go to the races with his uncle who was visiting. And he just had this vision of everything that he had somehow built being taken away.
It wasn't necessarily the content of his films that was an issue.
He never could side with an injustice. He never felt that anyone should be mistreated for their beliefs or where they came from or what language they spoke. He was a firm believer in equal rights in every way that shows itself.
The problem for him came by joining the party, like so many others of his generation.
And he and his wife, Jean, they were very social people. My grandpa was a very charming man, and they offered to host parties to raise money. They were fundraisers for various causes at the time. At one party in particular that he was hosting, I forget the gentleman who came into the restroom and said to my grandpa, "Have you ever thought about joining the Communist Party?" My grandpa was shocked and said, "No, Jean and I would never, no." And he said, "Well, why not? Everyone in your living room is a member." And that was the first he'd heard of it.
But Robert Lees did come around. He joined the party.
My grandfather was not shy about the fact that he was a member of the Communist Party, and a big piece of what was so disheartening to him, I believe, was that at the time it was perfectly legal to be a member of the Communist Party.
Yeah.
And therefore, all these people that were rounded up and forced to testify really hadn't done anything wrong. They were just doing something that was disliked.
Lees would be forced to testify himself before the committee. And he could either admit to being a communist or name names himself. By the early 1950s, there was little sympathy left for communists in the United States. The tide had truly turned against them. But J. Edgar Hoover wants to turn up the heat even more. He isn't satisfied with the short jail sentences given to the likes of Dalton Trumbo. He doesn't want his agents letting their guard down in the fight against the Red Menace. So he again turns his attention to Charlie Chaplin. Remember, Hoover had been adamant at the time of the earlier congressional hearings in 1947 that Charlie Chaplin should not be called.
HUAC was the wrong tool to use against Chaplin.
HUAC was the wrong tool because Charlie Chaplin wasn't a member of the Communist Party. Hoover knew that Chaplin wasn't a member, but he did have a significant weakness that the authorities could exploit. John Spartalotti, author of J. Edgar Hoover Goes to the Movies.
Here is where his lack of U.S. citizenship comes in handy, and the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, becomes the entity with which to go after Chaplin.
My grandfather never became a U.S. citizen. Every time he left the country and came back, he had to apply to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. From a purely practical point of view, this wasn't such a big deal through the 20s and 30s because traveling across borders was difficult. Commercial airlines were still in their infancy, and the vast majority of people traveled by boat, which was cumbersome and time-consuming, so Chaplin, like many others, didn't do it very often. In 1948, he decided he was going to take a trip, leave the U.S., and head back to the United Kingdom. Chaplin's hearing with the INS was no ordinary interview. The agents were getting direction from Hoover and the FBI.
The interview is very contentious, extremely political. It's grilling. It reads almost like a HUAC interrogation.
Do you consider yourself a member of the Communist Party, Mr. Chaplin?
I certainly do not.
We don't have an audio copy of the interview itself. If it exists in the FBI archives, we can't access it. But the full transcript is available in Chaplin's extensive FBI file. We've recreated it with actors.
Have you ever made any contributions to the Young Communist League?
I never have.
Have you ever made any contributions to the Communist Party?
Never.
They want to know about Chaplin's membership of organizations. They want to know who he's given money to and why.
In 1922 or 23, did you make a large donation to the Communist Party?
I did not.
Have you ever made any donations to the Communist Party?
I'm sure never. Not to my... I'm sure.
On November the 20th, 1942, was a dinner held by the Russian War Relief Incorporated known as the Chaplin Dinner?
Yes, that's true.
What was the occasion for that dinner, Mr. Chaplin?
Russian war relief.
Did you give money to this organization? Are you friends with this individual who we know is a communist? This interview comes across as a kind of inquisition.
Mr. Chaplin, I understand that you have been, that the press from time to time has indicated that you were more or less interested in communist-sponsored movements in this country. Is that correct?
No, not communist-sponsored. They may have sponsored certain... I am just interested. I am a liberal, and I am interested in peace. But by no means am I interested in communism.
The interview is long and wild. The evidence against Chaplin is largely hearsay and gossip.
Hedda Hopper, Hollywood columnist, in her column December 27, 1943, stated, "From things I have learned, Charlie Chaplin contributed $25,000 to the communist cause and $100 to the Red Cross." What have you to say about that, Mr. Chaplin?
That is a complete lie.
Did you know she made such a statement on the radio?
No, and as a matter of fact, I never take these papers at all.
This would be over the radio.
No, I didn't hear it, and that is not true. We make our yearly thing to the Red Cross and have done so throughout the years. The same thing with the buying of war bonds and everything. I bought $500,000 worth of war bonds.
But the one thing they do want to know about is Chaplin's citizenship. Now, considering this interview is taking place because Chaplin is reapplying for entry to the United States, it's a reasonable assumption that the interviewer knows the answer to the questions he's asking.
As a matter of fact, Mr. Chaplin, you are not a citizen of the United States, are you?
I am not.
Have you ever applied for citizenship in this country?
I have never applied. From the time I was 19, I have always had a sense of internationalism, and I feel that it is coming closer every day for the United Nations and for one world.
Is that the reason you have never applied for citizenship in the United States?
Yes, I consider myself as much a citizen of America as anybody else, and my great love has always been here in this country.
There's an unease with Chaplin's lack of citizenship, a sense that he's not one of them, that he is, by legal standards, an alien.
It's a kind of xenophobia. There's a critique of Chaplin's rejection of nationalism. That is the defense that Chaplin uses for why he never took out citizenship, because I'm not a nationalist. You know, I'm an internationalist. I don't really subscribe to this artificial national boundaries that we've imposed here, and I instead see all of humanity as united. Like, that's his kind of worldview there. And that is seized upon as being an offensive view in the context of this burgeoning Cold War.
I am sure that I am not a communist, and my name will never be connected with any communist. I have $30 million worth of business. What am I talking about communism for?
Do you think the communist way of life is better than the American?
No. Of course, if I did, I'd possibly go there and live. At the same time, I am not antagonistic. I have never been antagonistic until... If they were to invade America, I'd be the first to take up arms. I certainly wouldn't take up arms if I see there's a wanton thing creating any helpless situation.
Would you take up arms to repel?
Yes, to repel any invader that came to the United States. Another thing, they don't like anybody that speaks frankly, the press. I haven't any decent public relationship in this country. I despise the press, and they have always lied about me. They have tried to build me up as a monster, all this sort of thing. I have lived a very quiet, normal life.
My grandfather decided not to take the trip that he had planned in 1948. It was more trouble than it was worth. But he was growing tired of protesting his innocence, protesting his Americanness, his loyalty to one cause and his hostility to the other.
My only object is to preserve democracy as we have it. I think there are certain abuses to it, like everything else. I think there's been a great deal of witch burning. I don't think that is democratic. I know it seems very strange and rather bewilders me why I should be considered a communist. I have been here 35 years, and my primary interest is in my work. And it has never been anti-anything. It has never been maybe a critical comment, but it has always been for the good of the country. I don't like war, and I don't like revolution. I don't like anything overthrown. If the status quo of anything is all right, let it go. In my sense of being a liberal, I just want to see things function in harmony. I want to see everybody pretty well happy and satisfied.
The Red Scare was not confined to Hollywood. The glamour and drama of the HUAC hearings captured the public imagination, but soon another figure came to dominate the anti-communist campaign in the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, why they sell out to communism in both the East and West? My answer is, and has been, because of the stooges and dupes of the Kremlin who are doing our planning for us in the State Department.
In 1950, U.S. Senator Joe McCarthy charged onto Capitol Hill with a campaign to purge communists from every corner of public life. He claimed that the State Department had been infiltrated by communists, a claim that led to an official Senate investigation.
The time has come for a house cleaning. We cannot, ladies and gentlemen, fight world communism with planners who are either traitors or who are hip deep in their own failures.
His efforts were completely separate from the HUAC hearings, but they added to the general sense of anti-communist suspicion and paranoia. That political environment, including the HUAC hearings, is often lumped together under the same name, McCarthyism. It's hard to calculate how many people were affected. Hundreds of people were sent to prison, and some historians estimate between 10 and 12,000 lost their jobs. Teachers, lawyers, civil servants were all summoned to Washington, and a summons in itself was often enough for people to get fired. Dalton Trumbo had been proved right. He'd been convinced that in this atmosphere, after careers had been destroyed in Hollywood, the average American would be next in line. People from all walks of American life were having similar experiences to Trumbo and Lee's, and facing a kind of political exile. It had a devastating effect on the people involved, and on their families, too. Larry Sapler has interviewed many family members of people accused by both HUAC and McCarthy.
The children, I think, really kind of were traumatized in a way. I mean, when I interviewed them, I found that they were somewhat reticent on the subject, not ready to really dig deep into what had gone on and what had happened to them. They would talk to you and they would sort of tell you, but it was like they were a little bit once removed from the experience. I think the experience really affected them, but they had issues. They had lots of issues.
His career vanished overnight.
Tanya Verrifield, Robert Lee's granddaughter.
I spoke recently with his daughter, Kathy, and she reminded me of the mistreatment she had at school from classmates. They received calls all the time at the home from the FBI. She would answer the phone and it would be them calling with a scare tactic. When he was blacklisted, he sold their house and moved his family to Tucson, Arizona. And even there, the FBI followed them. So my grandfather, who had gone from being a successful screenwriter in Hollywood, went to being a maitre d' at a hotel. And the FBI showed up and spoke to the owner of the hotel to let him know that he was employing a red and to sully my grandpa's reputation even there and try to make him lose the very hard-earned living that he was trying to eke out to support his family.
After his Communist Party membership had been made public, Robert Lees appeared before the House Un-American Activities Committee. We know from the transcripts that the committee was eager for him to name names. They offered him a way to save himself. They wanted him to denounce his writing partner, Fred Ronaldo. "Do you know Ronaldo?" they asked. "Who?" Lees said. "Your partner." I know my partner, yes." "And his name?" "I believe that is public information, sir, the one next to mine on the script." Robert Lees didn't name names. He understood what this would mean for himself and the people that he loved, but he wouldn't sacrifice his principles. That choice would cost him his career and the big house he'd earned in Los Angeles and pretty much life as he knew it. In his statement to the committee, he explained why. His granddaughter read parts of it out for me.
Statement of Robert Lees filed with the clerk for the record. I believe no man who has made writing his profession can completely disassociate himself from people. He writes about them, he writes for them. They are both his inspiration and his audience. Their political freedom guarantees the necessary tools of his trade, freedom of thought and expression. I believe I am here because in those 17 years that I have worked as a writer, I have functioned as a citizen. I firmly supported the election of Franklin Roosevelt. I joined with other writers and artists in actively campaigning for him. Being concerned with the rise of fascism in Italy, Spain, and Germany, I and others in Hollywood protested these dictatorships. During the war, I worked to better our relations with our allies. Since that time, since the death of President Roosevelt, I have felt a growing concern, along with many others, that our subsequent foreign policy has not been successful in achieving the peace the world fought so hard to obtain. Because of my concern and because I am a writer who has functioned as a citizen, this committee demands that I either conform to their dictates or be forced into silence. I am asked to purge my friends and my conscience under threat of having my 17 years of work and devotion to my craft end in blacklist. I know that I cannot write that war is preferable to peace, or that bigotry or conformity are virtues, or that one race or one chosen group are superior to any other and can dictate how others should live or how others should think. I cannot, because no man of integrity can successfully write what he doesn't believe, and no writer who is a true American can ever force himself to betray his citizenship and his friends, or write the kind of material that will be forced upon the American people if this committee has its way.
Unlike Lees, my grandfather didn't have to testify. By 1952, he's making plans for a trip abroad to promote his new movie Limelight. And once again, federal agents are keeping a close eye on his comings and goings.
The FBI investigation of Chaplin is now, in this stage, geared toward trying to equip the INS with evidence that it can use to block Chaplin's reentry.
The departure date gives agents a firm deadline.
The FBI is also feverishly working in 1952 to build its case. And here's where it starts going all the way back to 1922. It basically tries to document everything that it's had in its investigation to this point.
They go back over everything, right back to the earliest files on Chaplin. All the accusations against him, the personal and the political. They wanted him out. And this time they would get their way.
Hoover, in cahoots with the Attorney General, decides on a plan to essentially revoke that reentry permit once Chaplin leaves, and then therefore make Chaplin return and appear before yet another INS questioning session. If they can get him to perjure himself in the context of that inquisition, they could then exclude him on those grounds.
They want Chaplin to perjure himself, to lie to them under oath. They know they have nothing on Chaplin's politics. He wasn't a member of any organization. He hadn't overtly given money to organizations expressly for the purposes of supporting communism, and any statements he'd made publicly could be countered with reasoned argument. But what they do have is his personal life.
Their hope is to go back to the Joan Barry stuff.
Nearly a decade had passed since my grandfather had been taken to court by Joan Barry following their relationship gone bad. One case in which he'd been accused of human trafficking, the other in which he'd been accused of fathering her child. Legally, he'd come out of these trials relatively unscathed, but public perception was another thing. But it wasn't these cases the FBI were interested in.
But this allegation that Chaplin had paid for a couple of her abortions prior to all of that.
Abortion being illegal in the United States at this point.
Implicit assumption here is that Chaplin will deny this in this hearing, and then if they can prove it, they will now have grounds to exclude him.
On the 17th of September, 1952, Charlie Chaplin and his family, including my mom, Geraldine, boarded the Queen Elizabeth liner to Southampton. It was only 2 days later when the ship's radio picked up the news.
The story which makes the most sensational news is the departure of Charlie Chaplin for London. His homecoming to his native country after 21 years' absence will be quite a sentimental occasion for Britishers and for Chaplin. But the same can't be said of his departure from these shores. Immigration officials are prompt to suggest that the great comic may have difficulty getting back here if he wants to come.
Should Charlie Chaplin want to return to the United States, he would be subject to an INS interrogation. And that interrogation would determine, so it was announced, whether he is admissible under the laws of the United States. The Attorney General, James McGranary, gave a press conference. He indicated that this action had been planned for some time, but that they wanted to wait until my grandfather was out of the country.
He's also been charged with making statements that would indicate a leering, sneering attitude toward a country whose gracious hospitality has enriched him. No harm can come from a fair hearing. And if he can prove his worth for admission in meeting the standards of the requirements under our law, he can be admitted. But he'll have to meet them.
My grandfather decided it wasn't worth the trouble. After more than 40 years in America, he didn't need to prove himself.
Chaplin has put his studios up for sale, but is not at the moment selling his Hollywood home, and indications are that he does not expect to appear as an actor on the screen again. Later in the program, I'll review what may be his swan song as an actor, the movie Limelight.
A few months later, my grandfather would issue a public statement.
I have been the object of lies and vicious propaganda by powerful reactionary groups who, by their influence, have created an unhealthy atmosphere in which liberal-minded individuals can be singled out and persecuted. Under these conditions, I find it virtually impossible to continue my motion picture work, and I have therefore given up my residence in the United States.
Charlie Chaplin, the man who had done so much to make Hollywood the center of the entertainment world, would never live in the United States again. But that would not be the end of the story. The fight back was gathering force, and Dalton Trumbo was leading the charge. Next time on Hollywood Exiles.
January 1960, my father got a phone call from Otto Preminger, and all he said was, "Dalton, look at the front page of the New York Times today," and hung up.
Hollywood Exiles is a production of BBC Audio Wales for the BBC World Service and CBC Podcasts. I'm Oona Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was voiced by Paul Ryan. The INS agent was voiced by Johnny Glynn. Our producers are Glynn Tansley and Megan Jones. Music by Phil Channel and sound design by Kathy Robinson and Phil Channel. Our theme is by Nick Thorburn. Executive producer for BBC Audio is Martin Smith. At the BBC World Service, Prabjit Bains is senior producer and John Manel is the podcast commissioning editor. At CBC Podcasts, Jeff Turner is senior producer. Chris Oak is executive producer, and Arif Noorani is the director. Thank you for listening.